Hi, comrades. Welcome to tonight's educational, which is going to be on Marxism and alienation, introduced by Elaine Graham-Leigh, who speak for about 20 to 25 minutes on Marxism and alienation, and then we'll have some time for questions and a discussion, and then I'll make some announcements. So yeah, I do think of some questions if you have any, or if you'd like to make a contribution, don't be shy. But first, we'll hear from Elaine, if you'd like to start, Elaine.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. So alienation is one of those terms I think that, it's easy to kind of feel that you know kind of approximately what it means, but it's less easy to to really get to grips with actually with actually what it means in Marxist theory, because it can be kind of slippery as a concept. If you look it up, I mean, it's used a lot in sort of sociology and things like that. But it becomes something that just means, someone feeling separated from society or from their community. So, there's lots of stuff about sort of, alienated teens and that sort of thing. Or in fact, people feeling kind of, not valued at work. So there's lots of discussion about the sort of the downsides of Taylorism, which, as people may know, is a way of kind of breaking up work tasks into really small bits, and then you just give each worker this, this is your task. You stamp this widget, every 10 seconds for your entire working day. And there's so in sociology and sociology of kind of, workforce management and so on, there's lots of discussions about, well, that causes alienation in the workforce because it's boring. So how do you overcome that? So it becomes something that's actually almost quite ephemeral. And something that's largely kind of located in people's own understandings, in people's own psychology, and something that actually you can just overcome within capitalism by kind of tweaking things. So again, in the sort of the stuff about alienation at work, this is something that you can overcome supposedly by, having a nice break room for workers, or by redesigning their work tasks so that they only stamp the same widget half the time, or something, or things like that. But it's something that you just kind of make small changes and you can make everyone happier, and that's how you overcome alienation. And that understanding, I think, of kind of alienation as something that's located in people's heads and that can be and that can potentially be fixed, has actually given rise to some very odd discussion from a Marxist point of view. That there's a book came out, I think it was last year, arguing that actually alienation was a positive thing. So the argument there was that is that alienation prevents people from being pressured into conformity, and that actually it's much better to have alienation because otherwise you have kind of in groups and out groups, and it all becomes very exclusionary and so on. So there's kind of this sort of defense of alienation. And all of this is rather unfortunate, really, from a Marxist perspective, because it all really completely misunderstands what Marx meant by the concept, and actually how its centrality to capitalism and the degree to which it is actually harmful. So it's not just something that's just ephemeral and it's just about people feeling a bit miserable at work. This is actually a really profound damage that capitalism does to all of us. So okay, so let's get down to a definition. So what is it? So this is something that Marx talks about in the Economic and Philosophical manuscripts, which are manuscripts that he wrote in 1844, I believe. So it's when he's quite young, and they weren't written for publication. In fact, they weren't actually published until 1932, which is quite an important factor. We'll come back to that. So he says in these manuscripts that under capitalism, people are alienated in four ways. So they're alienated from nature, from the natural physical world. They're alienated from their own labor. They're alienated from their species being. And I appreciate that the meaning of that isn't necessarily immediately apparent, and we'll come back to what that means. And they're alienated from other people. And all of these things happen because it's because of how labor is made under capitalism into a commodity. So Marx says labor not only produces commodities, it also produces itself and the workers as a commodity. And it does so in the same proportion in which it produces commodities in general. So it's not just that you labor on the commodity, yet your labor itself is commodified. So he says the externalization of the worker in his product means that not only that his labor becomes an object, an external existence, but that it exists outside him, independently of him and alien to him. and begins to confront him as an autonomous power, that the life which he has bestowed on the object confronts him as hostile and alien. So this is where so this is getting to the point of this, because the worker doesn't own what he's producing, what his labor is going into. Sorry, I'm slipping into saying he because that's what Marx says. So the he or she, of course. Um, therefore, it's not something that the worker can relate to. So it's alienated from the worker. So when that's working on, physical things on the natural world, that alienates the worker from the natural world, and ultimately from anything that they're working on. So Marx also talks about this in another manuscript with wage, labor, and capital, which is quite a long quotation. And I've tried to kind of break it up, but it's all just so good. With the thing with Marx, when you kind of think, oh, I'll stop there. And then you think, oh, that next line is so great. So I'll try not to read out the whole thing. But so he says, the putting of labor power into action, i.e., the work, is the active expression of the laborer's own life. And this life activity he sells to another person in order to secure the necessary means of life. His life activity, therefore, is but a means of securing his own existence. He works that he may keep alive. He does not count the labor itself as part of his life. It is rather a sacrifice of his life. So he goes on to explain that it's not, the labor is a commodity that he's sold to other people. So what he's producing for himself is not the things that he's working on. It's not it's not the silk that he weaves, the gold that he draws up from the mining shaft. Marx says it's the wages that turns into. So he says, and the labourer who for 12 hours long weaves, spins, bores, turns, builds, shovels, breaks stone, carries hods, and so on, is this 12 hours weaving, spinning, boring, turning, building, shoveling, stone breaking regarded by him as a manifestation of life, as life? Quite the contrary. Life for him begins where this activity ceases, at the table, at the tavern, in bed. So Marx's point is that the work doesn't have any meaning for the laborer except that it buys him the means to live outside of the work. So he says, if the silkworm's object in spinning were to prolong its existence as a caterpillar, it would be a perfect example of a wage worker. Which I think is a really important little sentence to end that quotation there, because if you notice that he's saying that it's prolonging its existence as caterpillar. So obviously that's how silk is produced, but it's also the caterpillar, of course, is not the final state of the insect. It's an earlier stage. So what Marx is saying is that part of what this alienation does is it keeps the worker at a stage where the worker can't self-actualize. So it's an expression of it's getting to what the harms of alienation are under capitalism, that the workers can't develop as they should. They stay as caterpillars, even though their existence is prolonged. They're managing to live because they're getting wages and so on. So Marx isn't the only one who comes up with this concept. It's very interesting because the economic and philosophical manuscripts weren't published until the 20th century. George Lukács actually comes up with a very similar concept based on his readings of Capital. So it's obviously he's still taking it from Marx, but he didn't have the manuscripts where Marx kind of set this theory out in the most clear way. But from his reading of Capital, sorry, he came to a very similar conclusion. So he also noted how commodity relations under capitalism are reified, and this means that they're made into things of themselves. They're not just seen as relations, and they seem preordained and eternal. That this is something we get told all the time, isn't it? That capitalism is just the only way that the world can possibly run, and it's always been this way, and there's no possibility of changing it. And this has the alienating effect that Marx describes. So Lukács says, a man's activity becomes estranged from himself. It turns in a commodity which, subject to the non-human objectivity of the natural laws of society, must go its own way independently of man, just like any other consumer article. So again, he's got that same idea that what you work on as a worker is then independent of you, and it's a commodity, and it has that actually rather hostile relationship to you. So this is where alienation comes from. So we're talking here obviously about work and primarily work in kind of poor conditions, so factory work and so on. Those are the sort of examples that Marx was giving in that quotation that I read out. But it's important to realize that it's not just about working conditions. This again, like I said at the beginning, this is some of the sort of discussion in the sort of sociology of work of workplaces and so on that makes it about, well, of course, if you're working in poor conditions, then you're alienated, but if you're working in good conditions, then you're not. Now, it's fundamental to the nature of work under capitalism. It's about that necessity of working to live and the fact that your labor is a commodity. That's what creates the alienation. It's not about personally how much you hate doing your job. And in fact, you can have a reasonable degree of autonomy in your job and a reasonable degree of thinking, hey, this isn't too bad a way of earning the money to pay my bills. And you can still be alienated. So it's not something that's overcome by changing people's, day-to-day conditions, desirable though that is. Um, and it's also not something that's inherent to manual labor, even though those are the examples that Marx and Lukács talk about. It was interesting, actually, because I was thinking about this when reading, in fact, the Grenfell report, because I think this is actually what you see in a lot of what's in that report as to how Grenfell was allowed to happen. Is actually in many ways an expression of alienation. If people here do office jobs like I do, an awful lot of everyone's time at work is just kind of sending emails, and it's not really connected to anything real, even when it's supposed to be. So of course, some of the time that's the kind of the bullshit jobs that David Graeber talks about, that your job is actually really not to do anything that's at all meaningful for human life, and that's true. But obviously, an awful lot of the people involved whose jobs eventually were involved in the Grenfell disaster were doing meaningful things. They were doing like building safety and fire safety and so on. But it's a way that the alienation just turns their activity into send this email, check this box, fill out this form, and it becomes completely detached from the reality that at some point someone's got to make sure that a residential building is not actually going to go up like a torch. And that's the bit that becomes disconnected. So I kind of felt that is kind of an expression of a result of alienation that works in office jobs as well as in factory jobs. So it's important that we don't think of it as only something that operates for people who are doing kind of automated jobs and some manual labor and so on. So it has meaningful effects actually throughout society, and it's not actually just at work. Um, Lukács says that there is, as a result of alienation, there is no natural form in which human relations can be cast, no way in which man can bring his physical and psychic qualities into play without their being subjected increasingly to this reifying process. And this, I think, we can see has very profound effects on modern society. And I think, we can think about the sort of degree of sort of individualization, loss of community, and so on. And there's a constant tendency towards atomization, towards encouraging people to think that, there is no such thing as community. There's no actual meaningful bonds between people. There's no real way that you can work with others to change your communal life. You just have to be out for yourself as an individual. That again is a product of alienation. It's obviously a way of thinking about society, or the lack thereof, that is very much in the interests of the ruling class. But it's made much easier because of the operation of alienation. And I think also that the way that people tend to often think of themselves as think of the nature of the self as being a sort of mind divorced from physical existence. That's kind of that comes up in all sorts of discussions about various mental health issues that people have, is again a very alienated way of thinking, which I think is also exacerbated actually by doing an awful lot of politics on the internet. That in itself is an experience that encourages you to be alienated from your own physical being and so on. So, but I think that effect would only happen in a society that was already alienated, I think. But part of all of this is, as Lukács says, that it's about seeing that this is, that capitalism is inevitable and is impossible to oppose, and this is why alienation works very much in the interests of the ruling class. And in fact, it works because it works on a sort of on a societal level, that we are an alienated society. It's not just about people's individual consciousnesses. You can be alienated even if you, as a particular individual, don't have to work for a living. So this is something that Marx is very clear about, that the bourgeoisie are also alienated. It's just that they like it because it works in their interest, and they perceive that they can perceive that it works in their interest. So Marx says this in The Holy Family. He says the possessing class and the class of the proletariat present the same human self-alienation, but the former class feels at home in this self-alienation. It finds confirmation of itself and recognizes in alienation its own power. It has in it a semblance of human existence, while the class of the proletariat feels annihilated in its self-alienation. It sees therein its own powerlessness and in the reality of an inhuman existence. So we can see that this is something that spreads completely throughout society. It's not the case that it's only just if you personally have to sell your labor that you're alienated. Once you're born into an alienated society, you're going to be alienated regardless of your own personal circumstances. So one thing I think that I always used to find kind of challenging when I was first learning about alienation is how something that's just about that ultimately is about work can have such profound and far-reaching consequences, because we're used to thinking about work as something that you just have to get through, and that's something that you want to actually to take up as little of your life as possible, that you don't want to come take over your whole life. So how can something that's just basically about what you do in order to pay the bills have such profound consequences? And this is where we have to understand what Marx means by labor. So this is the explanation I promised you at the beginning of what the alienated from species being means. So for Marx, labor is absolutely fundamental to human nature. And this is kind of old again when you first come across that understanding, because we think of labor, of work, as something that's involuntary, who'd work if they didn't have to. But what Marx means by that is any purposeful activity to improve your world, basically, to work on the world around you and to change it for the better. And that's something that only humans do. So there's a famous quotation from Capital where Marx says, a spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. At the end of every labour process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the labourer at its commencement. So what he means there is that capacity to plan what you're going to do, to envisage what the result is going to be, and then do it, is something that only humans do, and it's something that makes us human. And this, incidentally, is this is borne out actually by the last couple of sort of century and a half, more than a century and a half of research into human origins. Actually bears out Marx's contention that it's being able to work. But to change the world around you that actually makes you human. So paleontologists use kind of development of tools as a way of identifying species which are potentially human, ancestral species, which are hominids, which are part of the same family, from species that aren't, because actually it's something that's distinctive about the human line. And it's the ability for creativity that is the mark of Homo sapiens, our species, actually specifically. So there's other hominid species like Homo erectus and Neanderthals and so on make stone tools. But the interesting thing about their stone tools is actually how boring they are. That they come up with a particular way of making like a sort of stone flake that you can use for cutting, and then that basically stays the same for like best part of 1 million years. So, they come up with a neat wheeze and they just carry on doing the same thing. And how you can tell when you start getting Homo sapiens is actually when the stone tools actually undergo really rapid development, that Homo sapiens are always fiddling with it and thinking, well, we could do this better. If we flaked it off a different way, you'd get a sharper edge. And what about a handle? And so on and so on. So it's that ability, not just to think, well, this is how, generations and generations did it, and we're going to do it exactly the same, but to think, how can we make this better? How can we improve our lives by working on these things? Is the hallmark of our species. So the way that that capitalism commodifies that ability to work on the world and alienates us from it, that's alienating us from what it means to be human. And this is what Marx means by how people are alienated from their species being. And it is an absolutely fundamental harm that capitalism does to us. It's not something that can be overcome by some comfy seats in the break room at work. I'm not saying no to the comfy seats, but it doesn't really raise to the level of putting right the harms of alienation. So so we need to understand this as something serious that capitalism does to us. So I guess the question for my last 5 minutes or so is, well, how do we overcome it? So the first thing to understand is that it is, as I hope I've made clear, is that it is absolutely fundamental to capitalism. So it's not something that you can kind of tweak your way out of. It is part of the structure of, it arises from the structure of capitalism, and it's part of the structure of the developed ruling class hegemony. That's a reification, that creation of alienation. It's all part of that edifice that is there to make us feel like, well, capitalism can't be changed. It's just how the world works and so on. So it's very deep rooted. So it's not something that's easy to change. There is a tendency, I think, particularly in the kind of the not really Marxist or discussions of alienation that you get if you Google it, to look for individual answers. So people will say, "Oh, it's important to overcome alienation by going out into nature more often," and this sort of thing. And this again, go to the park. It's not a bad thing, but I think the tendency that you see in some places for people to look for individual answers to alienation is itself alienated, actually. This is not something that there is an individual answer. It's not something that you solve by changing individual psychology. That itself is thinking in an alienated way. It's falling back on that sort of that atomization. That's what alienation does to us, actually. So we have to understand that this is something that needs to be overcome communally by overthrowing capitalism. And Lukács here, in particular, gives us some hope here. So he points out that that reification has a fatal flaw for capitalism. So he points out, as Marx had, that labor is a peculiar commodity for capitalism because it's the only commodity where the producer has an interest in limiting its consumption. Everything else, you want to sell as much of it as you can, and you want to produce as much of it as you can. But actually, labor, well, we want to say, well, actually, no, we don't want to just say be made to work harder and harder to sell more and more labor. And we want to be able to put limits on that. And sometimes we want to be able to say, well, actually, no, we're on strike. We're going to withdraw our labor entirely. So it's a commodity, but it's a peculiar commodity in that sense. And understanding our power as the only source of labor, the only source of labor in society is the working class. So we have tremendous power there, actually. And this is what Lukács points out, that the proletariat is the only class, therefore, who can break through that sense that capitalism is inevitable and unavoidable. That the bourgeoisie aren't going to do it because, as Marx points out in the Holy Family, they're very happy with their alienated society. It works for them. It's an edifice that works in their interest because capitalism works. At a certain level in their interest. But it's the proletariat who can see that actually, no, we need to change this and we need to organize to change it, and who can work together to change it. And I think, it's obviously the case that the kind of the atomization, the individualization, the hopelessness that alienation does to all of us as part of capitalism makes that organizing more difficult. But I think if you set out to think, well, we can't organize unless we overcome the alienation, that's kind of putting it in it's putting that organization as being beyond the point where you're never going to get to there. You have to understand that, yes, okay, we are all alienated under capitalism. This is a burden that we're laboring under. But actually, despite that, we know from hundreds of years of labor history that people can organize despite it, that we can come together, that it is possible for us to understand our oppression and to overcome our oppression. So I think understanding what alienation is, it's not something that that should make us despair at the weight of the damage that capitalism does to all of us. It shows us, I think, what we have to gain in organizing to overthrow capitalism. And I think it should actually, for certainly reading Lukács, he's actually optimistic. He gives us reason to hope that the proletariat can come together and can organize to overthrow capitalism. And alienation is part of those chains that we can and must throw off.